I mentioned Andre the Giant. A lot of you have emailed me asking me, am I going to talk about the HBO documentary? And I am going to talk about the HBO documentary because it was a fantastic documentary. I think Bill Simmons did a great job with this. It's about 90 minutes. Very fun watch. I mean, there were a lot of really sad parts to it, but it was, I thought, just an excellent piece of business. They had footage of Andre. They had a ton of footage. And it helped that they had the cooperation of WWE, because without it, they wouldn't have been able to have probably 90% of the footage that they included in this documentary. Maybe a little less than 90%, because there was actually a lot of rare, older footage of Andre that I would imagine Vince does not have control over. But there was a lot of WWE footage, and there were interviews with Shane McMahon and Vince McMahon. So it helped to have that cooperation. Did it help color the story of Andre? Did they shy away from any negative stories about him? Yes. And there have been. Look, there have been people like Kamala and Bad News Brown who, in shoot interviews, have had some unsavory stories to share about Andre and things he said and the way he's behaved at times in the past. I mean, nobody's perfect. None of that was addressed here in this documentary. But I loved, they had early footage of him training to become a wrestler. I had no idea that even existed. There's literal footage of him in a gym somewhere training to become a professional wrestler. And it's always a trip for me to go back and see this old footage of Andre when he was just this tall, lanky, skinny, giant of a kid. Because we don't really look at Andre that way. Unfortunately, a lot of people, myself included, because I grew up watching WWF right in the mid to late 80s, and so my early memories of Andre was as this big, lumbering, slow guy. There was nothing terribly flashy about him, and he certainly was not, he was not quick on his feet. But you go back and you watch Andre back in the 60s and the 70s and even the early 80s. And this was an agile guy, for a guy his size. He was flying around and he was a hell of a wrestler, for a guy his size. He really was. And then he started to slow down and it just got worse and worse. So I think it was really cool that I think this documentary exposed a lot of people, newer fans, younger fans, to a side of Andre they probably never even knew existed. They probably thought, oh, Andre, what a shit wrestler this guy was, right? He could barely move. He was so slow and immobile. But it wasn't always like that. It wasn't always like that. I love the story about Dick the Bruiser coming up with the name Andre the Giant when he wanted to book him. And he was talking to, and I don't know if he was talking, I don't think it was Vince Sr., but he was talking to another promoter who controlled Andre's bookings. And he said, look, I want to book Andre, or the Giant, or whatever he called him. And he asked, okay, what's his name? What name does he go by? And they said, well, he used the name Giant Ferry, which is what he had been called elsewhere. And I forgot exactly what Ferry stands for. But Bruiser just says, there's no way I'm calling this guy Giant Ferry. He goes, we'll call him Andre the Giant instead. And I laughed at that. Bruiser had the right idea. Giant Ferry would not work today either. I would imagine back then it would have worked even less. Today it still wouldn't work. They interviewed Andre's brothers in France. Didn't realize he had two brothers. They interviewed his daughter. I knew about her. Tim White, who was Andre's handler. I mean, obviously WWE referee for a number of years, but he was Andre's handler. Kind of the way that Jimmy Hart is Hulk Hogan's handler in many ways. That's what Tim White was to Andre for a number of years, very close to him. And that scene later in the documentary where he talked about regretting not being there in the hotel room in France, because, I mean, towards the end, Andre was just a wreck. And that's really where things get super sad later in the documentary. They show still photos of Andre in 92 and 93. And, I think it was one of his friends makes the comment in the documentary that she would see these photos of him and he looked like he was dying. And it's so true. You look at these photographs, he does not look well. You can look at them and see that this is a guy who is in pain, who is ill, and probably doesn't have a lot of time left on this earth. And they did not include footage, which was also sad, because I've been going through a lot of Andre videos on YouTube, right, with all this talk about the documentary. You kind of go down that wormhole, and you get lost. And the other night I ended up watching like 45 minutes worth of Andre the Giant related clips on YouTube. And one of the clips I watched was his last match ever, I believe it was. I want to say it was in Japan. This was in late 92. This may have only been about a month or so before he passed away. And it was like a 6-man tag, which is all he could do at that point. You know, you can put him out on the apron. He would come in maybe and do a couple of spots, and then he would just stand out there. He looked awful. I mean, he had to, when he came down to the ring, I don't know if Inoki was on his team, but whoever it was, as he was walking to the ring, he had to walk behind the Japanese star so he could put his hands on his shoulders so he had something to sort of steady himself as he walked to the ring. I mean, that's how bad things were at the end. They didn't include footage of that. They didn't have footage of his last match in the documentary. I'm not sure why, but the scene with Tim White where he just breaks down and says, man, I wish I could have been there. You know, because Andre's father passed away. He got called back to France for the funeral. This was in January of 93. And he went, I guess, alone. I don't know why he didn't take Tim White or somebody with him, but he went by himself and attended his father's funeral. And I think a few days later is when he passed away. They found him dead in a hotel room in Paris. And Tim White was very upset. He said, I should have been there. You know, nothing I can do now. There's no crying in wrestling, but he was holding back, you know, he was fighting back the tears. And it was just a very, just a very emotional scene. And how many times have we heard the stories of wrestlers who, you know, die alone in a hotel room somewhere? Usually it's from a drug overdose or something. That was not the case here, but it was still equally sad. Vince and Shane were interviewed. Vince McMahon gave us some insight into himself at one point. You know, it's very rare that we get insight into the man, Vince McMahon. It's hard to tell sometimes when Vince is being Vince, the human being, and when Vince is just being Mr. McMahon. I kind of think that at some point the two blended together. I don't know that... I don't want to say that the real Vince no longer exists, but it's sort of hard to tell. But he gave us a little bit of insight into himself here. He talked about the falling out he had with Andre. Him and Andre had a falling out towards the end. And I'm sure he regrets that. And he did get emotional, and he started crying, but he was doing everything in his power to fight back the tears and not show real human emotion. But he said, you know, I have the capacity to completely shut out any negative influences around me. So if somebody hurts me, I just get rid of them. And I just thought to myself, you know, that may be one of the realest things I've ever heard that man say. So I thought that was very interesting. Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair were also interviewed. I mean, how could you not have Hogan in a documentary about Andre? Hogan was all over this thing. He was telling his usual stories. And again, I just talked about Vince, right? It's hard to discern between the real person and the Mr. McMahon character that he loves to put out there, this public figure. Well, with Hogan, it's equally as tough, if not more so. I think that guy is in full work mode 24/7. His whole life is a work. It never ends. When the camera's off, it doesn't matter. He's always Hulk Hogan. I don't even know that Terry Bollea exists unless he's on trial with Gawker or something. But Hogan was telling his usual stories, and I like the one story he did tell that I think he's telling the truth about, because they actually showed the footage, and you can see what he's talking about in this clip. The story where he talks about rubbing the Vaseline, or trying to rub the Vaseline in his eye during the angle on Piper's Pit before WrestleMania 3, where Andre challenged Hogan to a match and he ripped the shirt off. Remember that? He ripped the cross off of Hogan's chest. You can actually see in the clip, they slowed it down and they showed it. You can see Hogan putting his finger up to his eye right before Andre reaches to rip his shirt off. So he's probably telling the truth on that story. That I thought was kind of cool. But he spouted off so many tall tales over the years, and I've talked about them here on this show. I am so entertained by the Hogan stories, the stuff about Metallica and the stuff about looking out into the crowd at Wembley at SummerSlam to see the sick kid and the seat was empty and he knew he died even though Hogan wasn't even at SummerSlam that year. I could go on and on with the Hogan stories. So it's hard with him to separate fact from fiction. He talked about, for example, not knowing the finish to the WrestleMania 3 match with Andre at the Silverdome. Going into the show that night, did not know the finish. And he said that Andre called slam right on the spot, right before he body slammed him. Andre called slam, he said. And then after he slammed him, Andre, I guess, looked up and said, leg drop. Right at the last second. And he claims that he thought Andre was going to kick out. He was going to drop the leg, and he expected Andre to kick out, and by God, he didn't. I don't believe that last part for a second. Okay, I do not buy that for a second. Not 1 second. Now, I can believe that Andre maybe was keeping him guessing, keeping him a little nervous about whether or not he was going to do what he was supposed to do, and that what they had wanted him to do, which was put Hogan over. And maybe Hogan was going up to him and was a little nervous and saying, "Are we cool? Are we okay?" And maybe Andre was being coy. And maybe Andre was saying something like, "Don't worry about it," or, or something to that effect. I can believe that. That sounds kind of sensible to me, that, maybe Andre would have done that to kind of screw with Hogan a little bit. But the idea that Hogan thought that Andre was going to kick out after the body slam and the leg drop is ludicrous. It makes for a great story. Hogan is a great storyteller. I will say that. And I will also say that whole WrestleMania 3 scene in the documentary, with that background music that they set to it, it made that match feel so epic. That was a great scene. The match itself was horrible. I mean, Andre could just barely move. But if you were to ask me, even now, okay, what is the single biggest match in the history of WrestleMania? Not the best match. What is the biggest match in WrestleMania history? It is still Andre the Giant versus Hulk Hogan in the Silverdome. That is still the biggest match in WrestleMania history. Hogan Warrior was also big. It was very similar in that it was another dome. So, in Pontiac, you had either 78,000 or 93,000, depending on who you believe. You had a lot of people, okay? You had more people than you did in Toronto. But in Toronto, you had almost 70,000 people. You had this epic main event between these two larger-than-life stars for the championship. And it was a similar dynamic in that you had the old guard passing the torch to the new guard, even though Hogan really didn't, in the end, he really didn't pass anything to the Warrior, but that isn't necessarily Hogan's fault. Warrior just was a flop as champion, so they went back to Hogan. So I think Hogan Warrior is a match that comes close. I know as a kid that match was huge for me, and it was unique in that you had two baby faces against each other. But I still wouldn't rank it above Hogan Andre as far as being the biggest, most epic match in WrestleMania history. That still belongs to Hogan and Andre. I think you come away from this documentary appreciating just the sheer attraction that this guy was, and the massive amount of pain he was in. Now, as an attraction, it's funny because the wrestling business was just so different back then. It was territorial, and guys would, Andre would be in one territory for a while, and they said you couldn't keep him there for very long because after a while, first of all, he's limited in what he can do. And, when you see this freak show attraction, which is pretty much what they looked at him as, after a while, if you see him every single week, every single month, it just becomes, old hand or old hat, I guess, as the expression goes. So they would bounce him around. He would go from place to place, and he was always this big attraction. Andre today would not be nearly as big of a star as he was back then. If Andre came along now, first of all, there have been people that have had the disease that he's had, who are as big and even bigger and taller than Andre was. For all the exaggerations about his height, he wasn't 7'4". Maybe he was 7'1", maybe he was 6'11". He wasn't 7'4". That was an exaggeration. Even Vince McMahon at one point in the documentary says, well, he probably wasn't 7'4". He may have been 7'1". I don't know. He kind of grumbles, like he doesn't really want to talk about it, but he kind of reluctantly admits that it was bullshit. So today, though, right? We've seen people bigger than Andre. And can you imagine Andre being on television every single week? Unless Andre had like a Brock Lesnar type deal. It's kind of like Big Show. Big Show is also this larger-than-life attraction. But he means nothing because he was on television. He's been on television every single week for 15 years now. So the way they treat these guys now and as much television as they have, Andre coming along now, if he even, would make it to the main roster, he wouldn't be special. After 3 weeks, he would be just another person. And people would chant, "You can't wrestle" at him and hurt his feelings. So, just for that era, he was the perfect attraction. The amount of pain he was in his later years, you just can't help but feel badly for the guy. Even though they make it very clear he made the choice not to have the surgery that guys like Big Show had and Lars Sullivan, He was out of action for a while. I believe he had the same surgery for the same condition that Andre had, the acromegaly. He opted not to. Once he found out what he had and that it could be treated, Andre, and Tim White even said this in the documentary, he was very fearful that it could negatively affect his wrestling career. He did not want to do anything that would somehow make him not as special of an attraction, and so he opted not to have the surgery. Now, it would not have reversed the condition. It wouldn't have fixed the condition. It would have stopped the advancement of the condition. And it's very likely he would have avoided a lot of the problems and pain he had later in life, and maybe he would have lived into his 50s and 60s. That was his choice. He knew the choice that he was making. Now, that doesn't mean it's still not sad, but, it's sad to a point. He made his choice, and, he had to deal with the consequences of that choice. And, unfortunately, those consequences were a lot of pain and suffering. The thing about it, though, I think about that, and I'm like, he was already a big guy at that point. I don't really think he got much bigger. Maybe his features got a little more warped, like his hands and his forehead and stuff like that, but if anything, he got shorter as the years went on. I think he was taller probably in the 70s and the early 80s than he was in the late 80s. Especially, when you have back surgery and stuff like that, you kind of shrink a little bit. So I look at that and I say, I don't know what he's talking about. He could have had the surgery and he still would have been Andre the Giant. But I guess he was just very, fearful about losing what made him unique. There were stories about him drinking 20 bottles of wine in the course of a day, and Ric Flair told the story about Andre drinking the 106 beers in one sitting. Who knows if that's true or not? I'm sure it was a lot of beers. Was it 106? Do you think Ric Flair or anybody in the bar that night was sober enough and paying attention to the exact number of beer cans this guy drank? I doubt that very seriously. But there's no way to disprove it, so these stories sort of take on a life of their own, and they become the Andre lore as the years go on. The man drank a lot. That's the point. The man drank in part to mask the pain that he had later in life. That, to me, was one of the other sad parts of the documentary. Besides Tim White breaking down at the end, Cary Elwes, the actor from The Princess Bride and Saw. I will always also remember him from the very first Saw movie. But he was interviewed, and he said he had a conversation one night, while they were filming. He talked to Andre, and he goes, people love to laugh about all the alcohol he could drink. But he said he had a very serious conversation with Andre, and it was very sad because Andre confided in him that the reason he drank so much was because he was in so much freaking pain. And that's just really sad. I loved all the Princess Bride stuff in the movie, by the way. That in the interviews, they had interviews with Robin Wright and Rob Reiner and Billy Crystal. That's still one of my favorite movies. It's like, if I ever have a kid, when they're old enough, that's one of the first non-animated movies that I would show them. Even though the part with the giant rats in the forest scared the bejeebus out of me as a kid, but it's such a great fit, just such a great story, that film. So anyway, that was my thoughts on the Andre documentary. It's well worth going out of your way to see. Is there some, creative license taken with some of the stories? Of course. These are wrestlers. These are workers. That's what they do. They tell stories. But you do learn a few things, I think, that you might not know about Andre. And it's just it's very well done. And interestingly enough, I think the executive producer credit went to Kevin Dunn. So I don't know how much of an influence Kevin Dunn had on the documentary. I would think if he was, I think they called him executive producer. I'm not sure. Or maybe he was just a producer. But you got to give him credit too. If he had a hand in putting all this together, maybe they're just giving him credit because of the WWE footage and he didn't really do that much. I don't know. But it was interesting to see him given a prominent credit at the end of the movie. But definitely go check it out. If you have HBO Go, it's on demand. You can watch it anytime.